The black earth split open like a gaping wound. Leaning over the edge revealed only darkness and the smell of damp soil, bitter musk, and the essence of death. The sound of the pit was alive with a chorus of hissing. A slow, rough movement was heard from below. It was into that throat of darkness that a man was cast. Not just any man, but the most legendary Viking to ever live. His body didn't strike the ground because the dirt was covered by a blanket of living, writhing, slithering creatures. Snakes. The snakes quickly, as if they were waiting, began to absorb Ragnar's body. Endless in number, their scales scraped like sand across stone. Their tongues flickered in the silent burial that was taking place. Their hiss was deafening when there were 1,000 within millimeters of his ears. Looking up, the sky had become a small coin of silver from the vantage point of the bottom of the pit, but the light, it was already beginning to dim under the tide of their bodies. They poured over him until even light seemed to be swallowed, covered, buried, overwhelmed by creatures synonymous with death. There was a vast array of types. Some moved quickly, some slowly. They tightened around his limbs, others slithered across his chest, pressing, probing. And then a third, sliding higher, invading the soft tissue around his throat. Then the first bite, the sting, but nothing compared to the burn of the blade, which he had felt many times before. Another bit, and then another bit. Now the bites became more frequent, as if the brood has a hive mind that was triggered by the first bite. The fangs sank deep, and the pressure built around his limbs. He feels both ice and fire in his veins. Their scales continue in constant sliding over his body. These snakes are doing their job by ushering this thorn in the side of England into his eternal resting place. But before Ragnar boards the ferry to eternity, from under the mass of asps, Ragnar lets loose a laugh. Most men would have screamed from the moment they hit the pile of serpents. Most men would have begged, would have pleaded, would have been consumed by fear, but not Ragnar Lothbrok. He laughs. Those standing around the edge of the pit were in awe of this laughter echoing from the bottom, from the darkness of the pit. The defiance, fearlessness, and boldness was something that no one would ever forget. The sound was thunder that still echoes beyond the Viking age. For Ragnar and for the pre-Christian Viking age, death was seen as a passage to a feast that awaited beyond. The saga tells of halls where warriors drink with gods, where food and ale are limitless, and where laughter rolls on forever. So he meets the fangs not with fear, but with defiance, and embraces what he believes is his entrance to Valhalla. This is the climax of his tale, or perhaps it's only the beginning. But here's the question. What do you believe about the most legendary Viking in history, Ragnar Lothbrok? Was he a man, a myth, or a combination of the two? Was he real or imagined? Either way, his laughter still echoes from the pit today. And you, yes, you, get to decide whether or not Ragnar was fact or fiction. We're going to look at the evidence and we're going to weigh the results. There is, however, a piece of evidence that may shock you, that might just flip the entire narrative on its head. Everyone thinks they know Ragnar. Oh, you've seen him on TV, a charismatic leader with a chiseled Viking physique, leading an army into Europe. You've watched actors wield his name. You've scrolled past him in memes and on social media posts. He is painted as the archetype of the Viking raider, the farmer who became a king, the king who became a legend, the legend who became a Netflix series. But history is a slippery slope. Once you go down that road in the interest of truth, you might not like what you find. The sagas are poetry. They're not eyewitness reports. Chronicles wrote with agendas, not necessarily objectively. And a lot can happen over 100 years of oral tradition. Just know that if you're interested in facts, facts don't care about your feelings and your hopeful expectations. So what are we going to do with this figure who seemed to stand with one foot in history and the other in myth? Do we dismiss him as fiction, or do we take seriously the possibility that the most famous Viking of all time was stitched together from multiple real men whose exploits are real and did have a lasting impact in history? But it's not one man. Here's what I want you to gain. By the end of this episode, I want you to know who Ragnar was or who he wasn't, and why these ancient sagas and stories still shape our idea of the Viking spirit more than anything we've uncovered to date. The main content of what follows is drawn from two major Icelandic texts. One of them is called The Tale of Ragnar's Sons. But these aren't the only voices from the Viking or post-Viking age. Saxon and Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Frankish annals, they all add fragments of evidence, helping us piece together whether Ragnar was flesh and blood or saga and smoke. The story does not begin in a throne room, but in a field. A man with rough hands, soil under his nails and in the cracks of his hands. Daily he mended fence posts, fed his animals, and tended to his crops. The wind off the fjord bit and weathered his skin. The smell of salt and iron were always swirling in the air. Some sagas say that Ragnar was born of royal blood, grandson of a king. Others whisper that he was nothing more than a clever farmer, smart enough to know the land can feed a man, but the sea can grant access to wealth and freedom beyond measure. Outlaw, prince, peasant, the origin shifts depending on who's telling the tale. And maybe that's fitting, because Ragnar was all of these things. It just depended on whose eyes you were looking through. Ragnar didn't rise alone. He had men. Men gathered around him. Men weary of taxes from petty lords. Men hungry for plunder and the possibilities of silver. Men that were running from reality and chasing dreams of their own. Ragnar offered what few could, a vision. Not of safety, but of danger. Not of law and subjugation, but of independence and freedom. He had the uncanny gift of making you believe that if you followed him, it was not to lose your identity, but to find it. So when he called, they came. They shouldered axes, they brought their shields, and they locked arms with one another as equals. And equality was what Ragnar, the greatest leader of the Viking age, offered. He wasn't interested in hierarchy, but in liberty for anyone and everyone who sought life on their own terms. Ragnar and his crew, they left the frozen coasts, and they sailed on into Europe, deep into Europe. You can picture it, the dawn mist lifting on the Seine, bells clanging in panic from the monastery spires, the monks trembling, scattering, clutching their relics, eyes full of terror. And downriver, the ships they come. Long, sleek, low to the water, dragons carved on their prows, oars dipping in perfect rhythm, sails fat with the morning wind. The locals knew of the raiders and the monasteries that they were easy targets. Viking raids were not new at this point in history, and so a small band of locals mobilized at the sound of the alarm bells. Arrows arced from the shore like dark birds overhead. Shields on board slammed together with a crack forming a wall as the longboats glided onto the shore. Men leapt into the shallows, water splashing all around their legs. Axes gleam. The ground shakes with the pounding of their boots. Archers on the banks ran, and those that were too slow, or thought a farm tool could defend against the horde, soon met their end. The monastery doors splintered. Prayers mixed with screams, and soon the air filled with the smell of smoke. This was a common occurrence for Ragnar and his crew. Pillage and plunder, set things on fire, and create a reputation that would soon give way to legend. England remembers him. France remembers him. Paris especially remembers. In one saga, he besieges the city itself, the Seine choked with ships, those inside the walls trembling with fear. Whether one man could have caused such fear, or whether later poets stitched many raids together under his name, it's the historian's riddle. But the thunder of it, the shields clashing, towns up and down the rivers burning, that all happened, and that still echoes. If Ragnar Lothbrok was real, then we should surely see signs of his descendants. Lucky for us, the sagas record stories of love and betrayal. Ragnar's first wife was Lagertha, a shield-maiden, fierce enough to fight side by side with men, to stand true in the shield wall even when men faltered. The tale goes that Ragnar took notice of her and decided to test her. He sent a mean dog and a full-grown bear to attack her. She killed them both, without even breaking a sweat. And from that, he respected her and loved her. They married, they fought, and eventually they parted. Even though this is about Ragnar, you know this legendary wife. She is a legend in her own right, and we should give her her own episode soon. She's way too significant to remain a footnote. But Ragnar had a second wife, and she was the daughter of what they would say a dragon slayer and a seeress. This wife was steeped in riddles and prophecy. Ragnar also sent her a challenge to determine whether she was worthy of marrying. This time the test was a riddle. She was clever enough to solve the puzzle to his liking. And so this clever woman won the heart of this clever man. Together they bore sons whose names would ring across Europe, like Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd the Snake Eye. Each had a path of destiny, and each carved their mark on history. Marriage and offspring are a huge piece of evidence for the historical view of Ragnar's reality. But does this truly answer the question? Because what's next might just unravel everything up to this point. The sagas begin to grow stranger. They tell of Ragnar wearing magic trousers, hairy breeches. They were dipped in pitch and sand. What kind of tactical advantage does this provide? Well, none if you're fighting against humans. But if you're fighting a dragon, then it makes all the difference in the world. The sagas record that he fought a dragon. Its fangs could not pierce him. They say that he walked into fire without being burnt. Good thing for those magic pants. That's when he slew the monster in the thick of the forest. And then it says that he would boast at the feasts. He would tell tales of his legendary exploits. And the men, they must have had no reason to distrust him. And so his words became a weapon, and his reputation was carved not only in runestones, but by his own tongue. And to that, the skills of the skalds and their stories, they enhanced them and became even more grand, more fantastic. These fantastical stories, however, have left many of us in the modern age slightly more skeptical than if these stories had been left out altogether. So which parts are true and which parts are fantasy? Did he really fight a dragon, or was the dragon just a king dressed in poetic writings? Did his breeches really protect him from fire, or was that the storyteller's way of saying Ragnar was stubborn enough to walk through any danger? Did he command fleets at Paris, or do we see here the blended faces of several warlords stitched together as one? Were his wives and their children real figures in history? The answer might surprise you. But one thing is certain. Myth or man, farmer or king, Ragnar's rise was epic nonetheless, and epic enough that we still hear of it centuries later. So did Ragnar Lothbrok ever walk the earth? The sagas give us a whole bunch of drama, raids, bears, fighting, riddles, dragons, fireproof pants. But sagas are later than the actual events, written in Iceland centuries after the Viking Age came to a close. And it's from these sagas that this figure, Ragnar Lothbrok, begins to emerge. But let's at least explore the evidence for a real-life Ragnar Lothbrok. First, we've got the Frankish Annals. In 845, a Viking leader with a name similar to Ragnar led a fleet of ships up the Seine and besieged Paris. Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, ended up paying him 7,000 pounds of silver to go away. But then the records note that this Viking leader died shortly after that due to a disease, perhaps a plague. The names being close make the story intriguing. Could this be Ragnar or just the colonel? One that led to the much later writings about the saga hero. Then there's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. In 865, they talk about the great heathen army that landed in England. Its leaders were named Ivar and Halfdan. Other sources add Bjorn and Ubba. These are, of course, the saga sons of Ragnar. If the sons were real, doesn't it follow that their father was as well? At the very least, men with these names did exist, and they left a bloody trail across the map of England. Add to that now, the Danish chronicler who wrote in the late 12th century, he specifically mentions a figure he calls Ragnar. This Danish writer would have had access to actual oral traditions that may very well have been preserved from earlier memories, and they may very well mean that Ragnar was real. Still, taken together, we only have threads in this tapestry. You have a Viking warlord attacking Paris in 845, an army of his sons ravaging England in 865, a Danish tradition of a legendary king who took part in raids and died in a snake pit. The case for Ragnar is not airtight, but it's not empty either. But for most modern-day folks, you, me, and every historian out there, we all approach information with a tremendous amount of skepticism. And to be honest, that's okay. Test the sources, test the theory. As long as the truth is the ultimate goal, then we're good. From the skeptical point of view, the sagas, they were written 3 centuries too late. And that doesn't lend themselves to trustworthy accuracy. Having a name that starts with the same letter or sounds similar is not proof of life. Other than the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, only his sons are considered to be accurate accounts of actual history. But if they are his sons, doesn't that make him real? His sons Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Bjorn, and Ubba, they were real. They were flesh and blood commanders leading the great heathen army against England in the mid-9th century. No serious scholar doubts they existed. But here's the catch. Medieval chroniclers and later saga writers assumed famous sons must have had an equally famous father. You might say at that time it was a narrative instinct to create dynasties and legends that needed epic origins. The sagas made that founder of these great men Ragnar. But most historians argue that Ragnar was not one man, but a composite figure, a Viking Frankenstein stitched together from several different Viking Age leaders, warlords, and warriors whose deeds blurred across generations. The storytellers, they are always eager for heroes as grand as Achilles, Odysseus, or Hercules. And so they took these legends and they bound them together into one. And there's also the practical point that Viking culture, they valued story over strict fact. A saga was never meant to be a courtroom deposition. It was meant to carry truth, or at least the spirit of it, even if that means bending the details. If we line up the records, the picture is less of a portrait than a mosaic. Each event, each man, each story, shards that piece together into one image that resembles Ragnar. And just like his epic children needed dad lore, their fathers needed equally impressive wives, so the sagas gave him two. But the stories, they don't stop there. Why not sprinkle in a little mythical dragon fight in there as well? History, it gives us fragments. Sagas give us fire. And sometimes we have to choose between what we wish was true and what actually is. When it comes to Ragnar and the reality of his existence, there's not a ton hanging in the balances. It's either true or it's not true, or it's a combination of both. But not every truth that is debated has so little at stake. And so my encouragement to you is to let truth lead you no matter where it ends up. Don't use wishful thinking to determine reality. Weigh the evidence and see what truth reveals. Now let's consider the evidence here. Was he real? The honest answer is yes. I believe that Ragnar was real, just not as we discussed all in one person, and probably not as the sagas describe him. Ragnar Lothbrok, dragon slayer in magic trousers, conqueror of Paris, father of a dynasty, laughing in a pit of snakes is probably, definitely not one person, or at least not completely accurate. But where there's smoke, there's fire. And behind the smoke, there most definitely was a Viking leader who had a tremendous impact on his men. He was most likely charismatic, a visionary, and a skilled warrior. But there are many of these type of men in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. So if you ask me, I say yes, he was real, and he was one among many. And if you ask me if the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok of the sagas is real, I'd say not as they are written, no. In that sense, Ragnar was both real and unreal. He may never have worn the hairy breeches, which is what Lothbrok means, by the way. He may never have fought the dragon, but his laughter in the snake pit, maybe his, maybe a different Viking king. Either way, it all still shapes how we see the Viking Age warrior, defiant, unbowed, and unforgettable. And perhaps that's the point and the most valuable part of this kind of history. The Vikings didn't just swing axes and hoist sails. They carried sagas in their bones. Ragnar's story was one of them, chanted in smoky halls, whispered on ships as oars dipped into black water, carved into memory long before they were written down. Even if he was part legend, that legend inspired men and women who lived in a world far more harsh than ours. And if it inspired them and moved them, it can do the same for us. Picture it, Ragnar laughing in the pit. Was it myth? Well, almost certainly. But that image of defiance in the face of fear, it echoes through centuries, and courage still works that way. When you hear of someone who stood strong in their darkest hour, doesn't that stir you? When someone stands peacefully for truth in the face of violence, in the face of opposition, doesn't that inspire you? Doesn't it remind you that you too can endure? You can stand, you can be bold and have courage. It's contagious. Ragnar isn't the only historical figure to have this impact, and I'm sure that you can think of many. And if you look around, you may even find that there are a handful who have lived or are living in our modern times. It's always difficult to stand for truth when the majority is pushing against you and has a completely different agenda. See, a dead fish can float downstream and go with the flow, but it takes a live one to swim upstream. And whether you believe Ragnar's story to be true, it's okay to enjoy the legends for what they are and still be honest about what is true. The Vikings themselves, they blurred the lines, but they also knew that the truth has power. And deep down, we all know this. Truth, it resonates because it's written on our hearts. And when we seek it, we do find it. And when we find it, the truth sets us free. So now, what are you going to do with Ragnar? Here's what I suggest. Enjoy what the sagas have written. Enjoy the inspirational tales. Learn from the courage that's portrayed for us in the sagas. Not just Ragnar's story, but many of the stories, many of the mythology. They may not be factual, but they can be meaningful, and they can point us in the right direction. And let me just say one last time, the search for truth in history, in stories, in life, it's never a waste. Ragnar now, he's one of the greatest Viking stories ever told, and if the fact that it's shrouded in fiction has left you a little bummed out, don't be. Enjoy the story, just in the same way that you would enjoy those of Odin stealing the meat of poetry or Ymir sprouting life from his armpits. These aren't newspaper clippings, they're firelight tales meant to stir the imagination and to anchor us into something bigger than ourselves, to help us dream and explore our imagination. And that being said, if you've made it this far and you think that you've got an argument for why Ragnar was real, I want to hear it, truly. This is a community of Viking Age fans that never ceases to amaze me. With all of the knowledge that you possess, the insights that you have, I am sure that you have something to add, something of value to add with this community. So share your thoughts in the comments, leave a review. Who knows? Your spark might just set off the next big conversation in Viking lore. Because here's the heart of it. Norse myth, it still matters. It matters because it reminds us that courage can laugh in the face of fear. It matters because it shows us how story can outlive death itself. And it matters because when we pass these tales forward, we stitch ourselves into a legacy older than kingdoms. So here's the ask. Subscribe, share, leave a review. Think of it as carrying on the saga, pushing it forward. And who knows what this podcast could become over time. Maybe a podcast of epic Ragnar Lothbrok proportions. But it won't happen alone. It takes all of us.